Hey everybody, thanks for checking out my presentation. I did it on the Town of Pines groundwater plume, which is a Superfund site in a little hamlet called The Pines, just west of Michigan City. I live in Michigan City and I practice real estate here, so I've been telling people about this site for a few years, and I knew that it was heavily contaminated, but I did not know the extent to which the contamination had occurred, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to learn about it. If you've ever been to Michigan City, especially to the lakefront, you've seen the NIPSCO power plant here. In all of the lakefront with its beautiful sand dunes and nice beach houses, you have this crazy looking yellow and brown ugly building, and then the famous cooling tower, which some people think is a nuclear tower, but that is not true. It's just to heat, or to cool off rather, the heated water from the plant's turbines before it goes back into the lake. So the NIPSCO plant is a coal-fired and also natural gas-fired plant. It started operation in 1950, and it is set to be decommissioned in 2028. From approximately 1974 until the early 2000s, NIPSCO used the Town of Pines landfill, which is called Yard 520, for dumping its coal ash. Coal ash is a family of products from coal burning, but they're all harmful. They all contain heavy metals, boron, cadmium, molybdenum, mercury, lead, arsenic, chromium, and others. Normally in coal, these are in just trace amounts, but once the carbon is burnt out of the coal, these chemicals become concentrated. And then when they're disposed of, they have a tendency to leach into the environment. So, according to the National Defense Research Council, long-term exposure to these chemicals can cause cancer, heart arrhythmias, liver and kidney damage. The dust from coal can cause asthma and lung damage. So they're pretty bad all around. According to an Environmental Integrity Project and Earth Justice report, the majority of 250 coal ash ponds surveyed were leaching into nearby water sources. Now, Yard 520 wasn't a coal ash pond, it was just a normal landfill, but it was what's called a partially lined landfill. So part of it had some sort of liner, like usually concrete, where all the stuff sits, and the other part of it was just dumped straight onto the ground. Interestingly, the EPA does not designate coal ash as a hazardous waste, and there were no federal rules about its disposal until a huge spill in Tennessee in 2015. And if you go to EPA's website now, you can click on a link to go look at that federal guideline about coal ash disposal, but it takes you to page not found, and you have to go to EPA's 2017 snapshot before the Trump administration made several sweeping changes to their website. I don't mean that to be a partisan bashing, but it's interesting to see the difference of how these administrations have placed importance on coal, especially since that was a big thing Trump campaigned on. So anyway, Yard 520. It is 37 acres. It was operated by a company called Brown Incorporated. The land was owned by the Adult Corporation and is still owned by that corporation. according to the county records. Now, like I said, this was a unlined landfill, and the crux of the issue is that it sits directly atop the aquifer that supplied the town of Pines wells. So after decades of dumping coal ash there, it leached into that aquifer. Here's a map of Yard 520. I wanted to get pictures of it myself. The last slide had 2 pictures of different gates on the property. Every time I went this week to go do it, it was always raining or very overcast, so I never managed to get pictures of myself. You can drive past it on Highway 20. I've driven past it many times and I never realized what it was. I always thought it was just a farm field, but it's actually a landfill. So the approximate borders of it are outlined in red. This is all the adult corporation's land holdings. These kind of notches are places where there were houses. Part of the EPA's remediation suggestions were using trees in a process called phytoremediation. They specifically suggested poplar trees could be used as natural cleaners of the ground. So I'm not sure if these forested areas are areas that have been seeded with trees, or if they are areas that the company owned but never dumped stuff into. They all look like they're older growth trees, so probably not seeded by the EPA, considering that cleanup only started 4 years ago. And then to give you guys an idea of the scale here, my house is this little house icon that's circled in purple, and then Michigan City State Prison is up here at the north between Sheridan Ave, Woodlawn Ave, and North 1100 West. And then there's a pretty expensive beach community north of the town of Pines called Beverly Shores, which you can see on the left corner of the map. And if I'm ever showing houses pretty much anywhere around Beverly Shores or even in the Pines, I don't see a lot of people who are very cognizant of the 520 landfill and all the remediation that's been happening over the last few years. So just an interesting aside. So after NIPSCO started dumping in the 70s, it took until 2000. A resident of the Pines reported bad tasting well water. Testing by the Indiana Department of Environmental Management found benzene in their well, the famous oil refining and plastic chemical, which is a known carcinogen. And this prompted testing by the EPA. So the EPA and IDEM surveyed multiple wells around the town, and they found high levels of boron and molybdenum. And then this was traced back to leakage from the Yard 520 landfill. It was also discovered that fly ash was used outside the landfill for construction, which I'll get to in a second. But this picture here, this is where the town of Pines Park was. And I remember driving past this several times and wondering what they were doing when they were cleaning it up a couple years ago. This was probably in 2017. But they had to take all the equipment down and excavate all of the topsoil and then refill it. So, talking more about the cleanup, in 2004, the Pines dumping site was designated a Superfund Alternative Approach Site. This is an alternative to the National Priorities List, and it's designated for more expedient remediation when there's long-term processing required and when there's a potentially responsible party that can negotiate a cleanup agreement. So in this case, NIPSCO was the lucky or unlucky company that got to negotiate that. Part of this negotiation was that NIPSCO was mandated to pay for municipal water hookup to the town and all the costs associated with that. During that hookup process, that's when they discovered coal ash was used as backfill on residential properties and also in the park. So then the scope changed from just excavating out 520 to also residential properties, and that began in 2016. There seemed to be several drawn-out environmental studies done in the 12 years between the water hookup starting in 2016. And cleanup is still ongoing. So this picture on the left, this is from 2019. If you go to this website, Indiana Environmental Reporter, there's a nice documentary about the guy who owns this property and about the cleanup in general. So they have the date tentatively 2021 on EPA's website for finishing. I personally don't think that's going to happen because it seems like there's a lot of contaminated areas and it's quite laborious to be excavating this topsoil and planting trees and doing ongoing water testing. So, right, that's a lot. Compared to sites like Norco or the coal mining towns in West Virginia, the town of Pines seems to have fared quite a bit better. For the 4 tenets of environmental justice, there was procedural justice, maybe not in the siting of the landfill, but that was done, in the 50s or the 60s, so people probably were less concerned back then. In the cleanup process, the residents of the Pines in Michigan City had comment periods and meetings, and there was some say on how the cleanup was going to be done. For corrective justice, NIPSCO at least was responsible for paying for the remediation of the landfill and people's properties, and then also the municipal water hookup. As an aside, the plant has also invested in modern emissions controls, which I don't think is related to this incident in particular, but bodes well for all the people who live near the plant. And then, as maybe the most important piece of corrective justice, NIPSCO is eventually decommissioning the plant in 2028, and they are moving to more sustainable energy production alternatives like wind and solar. They also have a plant in Wheatfield, Indiana, which is by Valparaiso. That one's shutting down too in favor of alternative energy. The town of Pines residents obviously were disproportionately burdened by this contamination compared to the surrounding people, certainly, but definitely compared to NIPSCO, who only profited off of it, until recently. There's also a second distributive justice issue in that NIPSCO is located on the west side of Michigan City, which is a generally low-income area that also has a lot of people of color. So just being near the plant, even with emissions controls, disproportionately burdens them with health effects. And then those people are not in a position of high social mobility, so those areas don't get invested in, and then those people are sort of trapped. And I would say this is sort of true for the town of Pines also, not Beverly Shores, which has houses that are in the high hundreds of thousands of dollars and millions of dollars. But like, to give you an example, this house in this picture, this is actually a listing I have in the Pines, but this is sort of indicative of the worst on the west side of Michigan City, and it certainly is not the only house in the Pines that looks like this. Now, there are definitely some really nice places out there too, but this is not the picture of a community that's empowered to affect a lot of great environmental change. And I would say there are just as many places like this on the west side of town and in the Pines as there are, I don't know what you'd call it, normal houses or higher dollar properties. So this gets into the issue of social justice. I don't personally feel that a large portion of, I'll include Michigan City in this too, has a lot of power to affect change against NIPSCO, or which is a big employer in the area. We're not a super wealthy town in general. There's lots of the school system here has never been considered good as long as I've been alive. So there's just a whole bunch of social justice work that needs to be done to empower people. And even this remediation is a huge step in the right direction. It's definitely not the end of the road. There's also maybe the broader social justice issue, right, of the environment being such an enormous public good, but this is not the first coal spill, coal leakage. There is not very much regulation on that until 2015. Like I said, this is nothing about oil spills or other negative environmental accidents. And I just, we talked about in class that the Superfund and EPA's power to enforce it seems to be, especially lately, pretty impotent. And I mean, how do we solve all this stuff? These are hard questions, and they have repercussions that go way beyond the environment, as far as like making ripples in the economy. And there's a lot of good points all around and a lot of bad points all around. And it seems to me like we need something, the polluter pays sort of thing that was originally set up for oil companies under the Superfund and CERCLA, and then was done away with. Because, I mean, even with this like coronavirus, sorry if I'm going off on a tangent, but humans in general don't seem very good about preparing for these types of things, so maybe we need to have some type of bureaucracy where we have, who was I listening to? I think someone made this point on Sam Harris's podcast, that if we could just have a set of procedures in place, so when we have a virus outbreak or an oil spill, we just say, oh, okay, let's do X, Y, Z, and there's no, if we do the deliberating when we're not in the middle of a crisis, we set aside that money preemptively, then I don't know, it just seems like things would be way less complicated, and we would be much better equipped to solve some of our pollution problems. But I think that has to go along with this change of consciousness too, in regard to pollution, especially pollution and capitalism. I think we can have a system where people are still innovating and people are choosing to reward the innovators who don't pollute. and I think there's a way to internalize costs that is not disastrous for businesses. But I digress, because it doesn't really have anything to do with the Pine Super Fund, although maybe it sort of does. And I'm already 20 minutes into this. So if you have any questions, then definitely leave a comment, and I will try to remember to go back and answer them. Or if you want to debate me, send me a message on Canvas or leave a comment on my presentation, and we can do that too. So thanks for watching. Oh, and here are my references, if you want to look at those. All right, bye.